30 years ago, I stood in front of a comic shop advertising the death of Superman in its window display. That moment outside Heroes World set me on a path, a lifelong fan journey leading directly from that tattered red cape to this podcast. Now, together, we mine Superman's vast 85-year mythology by examining, discovering, and reconsidering the stories that have shaped the last son of Krypton. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Superman Up in the Sky and Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, both written by Tom King, is the host of Truth, Justice, and Hope, a Superman podcast, returning guest, Grant Richter. Welcome back.
Hey, Anthony. Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. I've seen you tweet about these works, and based on what I know about your tastes and your interests, especially when it comes to Superman, I thought you would be a great guest to talk about this pair of Tom King written works, both of which I read for the first time for this podcast. So there's a lot that we have to lay out in terms of setting the table and all of that, and we'll give the setup for each of the books, and we'll get into it. But I guess just as a starting point, when I had you on the show last year and we talked about Superman Smashes the Klan, we talked about your Superman fan journey and how you are newer to the world of Superman. You've certainly more than immersed yourself over these past few years. But specifically with these two works, when and how did you come to each of them? Were you reading them as they were coming out? What was your experience?
I read Woman of Tomorrow as it was coming out because I was well immersed in my fandom by then. I read Up in the Sky on the app in 2021, and I absolutely love them both, which is, I did not think I was going to like Up in the Sky, honestly, because I've read some Tom King before, mainly his Vision miniseries for Marvel, because I really like that character. And that made me really sad. And because of how my brain works, I spend a lot of my time going out of my way not to be sad. So I avoided a lot of King's other work, especially from what I heard about it on Twitter, like Heroes in Crisis and Adam Strange and Mr. Miracle, that it's, Tom King's kind of go-to thing is give me an obscure character and I'll see how I can make them sad. And so I was like, all right, well, I'm going to read Up in the Sky, but I have reservations, and I loved it right away. So when Woman of Tomorrow came out, I was like, yeah, I got to get this month to month. I think it works better as a trade, but it was still really good as a monthly.
Gotcha. That was one of the other big things that I wanted to ask you. So thank you for addressing it, your opinion on Tom King, because the sense that I get, I'm not speaking for people, but the sense that I get, folks seem to be a bit split when it comes to King's work. Definitely has tons of fans, but also those who don't kind of gravitate towards his style. I'll say for myself, a few years ago, one of the comic shops that I featured in my other projects, they host their own convention where they rent out a hall and they bring their back issues and they have some programming. And that's where I came in. So my buddy Sean Hendricks from Fat Moose Comics, he and I, we did a panel. We did a book club discussion at one of these store-run festivals, conventions. And one of the years we looked at Mr. Miracle and the Vision. And, I had heard nothing but amazing things about both of those works. And I read them for the first time in advance of that convention and that panel discussion. And I didn't dislike them, but they didn't resonate with me to the extent that they seem to for other people.
Yeah.
I had read the beginning of King's Batman run, and for the most part, I actually did like it, but then I kind of fell out of it. And in terms of some of what I was hearing about it, I don't know. I have to read it for myself to really form an opinion. But other than that, I can't say that I've really, done a deep dive into the man's bibliography. So from what I have read, I guess Heroes in Crisis, which you had mentioned before, that's another example of something that I had read enough of to know.
Not for me.
Not for me.
No sadness. No, thank you.
It's not even that, honestly. I thought that the concept of it was really cool, but Wally West is very near and dear to me. That's my Flash. And so the direction that story went in was kind of a tough pill to swallow. But To your point, yeah, I mean, it really seems like a hallmark of King's work. Not every single thing, but
Mhm.
definitely you see this in a number of instances, is work that deals with mental health, with depression, with grief, with trauma. And
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, it can be heavy. That again, that in and of itself isn't necessarily a turnoff to me. But like I said, those couple of stories in particular that I had read just didn't do for me what I guess I thought they would, what they seemed to for other people. So that's all to say I'm kind of somewhere in between when it comes to King. I haven't really formed that full or that strong of an opinion yet. More so now after these two works. But going into this, I was kind of like, all right, I was pretty open minded, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah, there's another podcast I listen to called the Dr. DC podcast, and they did a whole thing on Tom King, and they just based on what they've said, I'm like, I like Mr. Miracle as a character. I keep trying to start it, and every time I start, I get about halfway through the first issue, and I'm like, nope, I can't. I do really want to read his Human Target, though. I've heard that is amazing, and the new miniseries he's putting out, I forget the name of it. It's got like Warlord and I want to say Metamorpho and somebody else in it, and that sounds really interesting. But yeah, his heavier stuff, I just have to keep a distance from it for my own mental well-being.
I will say, and I think it's all on the app now. I really need to get on this. His Gotham City Year One,
Mm-hmm.
right, with Phil Hester, that really takes a look at the you know, the origin of the city and the rise of organized crime in Gotham. I mean, Gotham Central is one of my all-time favorite comic book series. Period, Batman or otherwise. So just kind of on paper, that really speaks to me. So I am excited to check that out. With respect to these two stories, Up in the Sky and Woman of Tomorrow, again, didn't read either one as they were coming out. With Up in the Sky in particular, I mean, that came out before, I mean, years before I had even started this podcast. And, you know, not that my Superman fandom was waning, but I wasn't as plugged in. You know, I certainly am
Mm-hmm.
more so now. What actually put Up in the Sky on my radar back when it came, which was, I don't even have the year offhand, but was it 2018, 2019? It's, you know, not
Uh,
that long ago.
19, I think. Yeah.
Gotcha. So what actually put it on my radar at that point was I was in the process of making my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country. And as the audience knows, I've done a lot of work on the comics retail side. And so when DC announced this Walmart exclusive deal, and that's what Up in the Sky was part of, that they were going to be selling these comics featuring original stories by King and Andy Kubert, the Superman story, and then Bendis was doing a Batman story. And these would be available exclusively through Walmart. The implications to the comics retail industry, that's what kind of I was dialed into. And
Okay.
as you might expect, and this was not all retailers. I think a lot of retailers kind of saw maybe what the intention was or what the potential benefit could be. There were also a lot of retailers who took offense at this, the idea that DC was catering to the the non-direct market, and that this
Right.
wouldn't even be available to them. Eventually, of course, the collected edition was, but those single original issues you could only get through
Mm-hmm.
Walmart. So that's kind of what my kind of perception of this whole thing was really kind of through the lens of the comics retail industry and the idea that these were only available in comic shops. So that, or not in comic shops, in Walmart. So that was kind of the big thing about Superman Up in the Sky, even putting aside the content and the substance of it, was that piece.
Yeah, yeah, I can totally see that. And it's so weird that they went directly with Walmart because, I'm old enough that I used to get the majority of my comics like at the gas station, right? It's called a Stop and Go in Columbus, Ohio, and I kind of miss that, and it's just unfortunate they went. You don't have the option to either choose your direct retailer or your quote unquote spinner rack. It's odd. That probably would have turned me off because I'm not a big supporter of Walmart because of different practices they have. But I'm glad that we've got it now collected and on the app and so forth.
Yeah, it's and not to dwell on this, but it was sort of a weird thing because on the one hand, and this was a part of the documentary film and something that we've talked about a lot on my comic shop history, my other podcast, where for the industry to grow, right, we need new readers. We need to bring new
Mhm.
people into this medium. And so an attempt to get the books in front of non-comics readers to kind of meet them where they are at a place like Walmart I do think makes sense, and there is some value in that. Now, the flip side, and in defense of those retailers who were kind of put off by this, perhaps there was a way where they could have also been available, in comic shops, right? Because I guess the idea is, if you're really trying to capture people who are not in stores, not in comic shops, again, Walmart makes sense, but for the people who are already comics fans, you would want to serve them too. So, I mean, I guess you can argue eventually they did with the collected edition and all of that, but I kind of see both sides of it. But in any event, we end up with this collected edition, which again is also available on the app. And I mean, I guess it's the equivalent of 6 issues, but each issue has essentially 2 10-page stories. So I think when you look at this entire thing, we're looking at about 12 10-page chapters that make up the entirety of Superman Up in the Sky, again, written by Tom King and drawn by Andy Kubert. And the essential premise is that this young girl has been abducted from Earth, and Superman goes on this quest across the stars, across the universe, to bring her home. And I guess let's start here. And of course, we'll talk about the Supergirl story as well, but just overall impressions of this story.
I love it. On your show, on other Superman shows, people are always asking the question, or on Twitter, what would you give to someone who wants to get into Superman but doesn't want to get mired with continuity? And I know a lot of people say All-Star. I would absolutely go with this, because you can either read it as being in continuity, or you can read it as being outside of continuity. It completely distills the character to everything you need to know. And I love Andy Kubert's artwork. I have since like the Heroes Return Captain America in the late 90s. I love his artwork. I love how uplifting this story is, and at the same time, going along with King's overall theme of mental health and trauma. It's about not only this girl's Alice, her struggle with trying to keep her spirits up under this horrible captivity, but Superman trying to keep moving forward after he just keeps getting beaten down and discouraged, and at any moment like this, anyone else would turn back. And it is the go-to story I read when I'm feeling down myself. This is my pick me up story. I love it a lot. I'll get into which ones are my favorite when we get further into it. But yeah, I love this trade.
I agree wholeheartedly. I absolutely love this. And I was kicking myself, as I said on Twitter, for being so embarrassingly late to the party on this. Like I said, when it originally came out, I wasn't yet doing the podcast. I wasn't as plugged in. And then since I've been doing the podcast, I guess I figured I would get to it when I did an episode on it. And this is one of those episodes, and as a fellow podcaster, although I know you at least have a chronology that you're following, so that I'm sure that helps here. It's kind of whichever direction I want to go in. And this is one of those episodes that kind of, I don't know, maybe floater is a decent term, where it's, it could go a number of different places. And maybe that's part of the reason why it took me a little longer to eventually get here. I'm so glad we did. I wish I had gotten here even sooner, but yes, I thought it was absolutely tremendous for all the reasons you said. I think it really, truly taps into, encapsulates, and presents the core fundamental attributes of Superman that make him so compelling, that make him relatable, that make him inspirational and aspirational. It really, really is beautiful. And I agree. As much as I love All-Star, and I've come to love All-Star a lot, and we did a whole episode on it, but I agree with you. We talked about this in that episode. And as someone who worked at a comic shop for many years, it's like I have made the recommendation of All-Star, and it's not that I would talk someone out of it, but yeah, if someone's really new to Superman or new to comics, one of the things that makes All-Star so beautiful is that it's this love letter to the various eras of Superman, right? But without some of the backstory, without the context. And I feel like I'm a good example of this. I think one of the things that allowed me to really access the story in a bigger, more meaningful way was going back and reading Golden and Silver and Bronze Age stories, and then getting a clearer sense of, that's what Morrison was pulling from, right? It works even if you don't have that, but once you do, it just like opens everything up. So yeah, for someone with no background, I agree with you. I think this is, there are still some personal favorites like Birthright or For All Seasons that I still go to those first. But
Mhm.
this really would be right up there. This does a magnificent job.
Yeah, and it doesn't bog you down with anything. Yeah, it mentions Luthor. He's only shown in one page of the whole book. The bad guy, or the big bad, is virtually non-existent. He's just a background element. We never even see him. It doesn't matter who the villain is. It's just Superman going up against obstacles, things in his way, and overcoming them every time.
Absolutely. It's funny because, so I suspect that we probably like, coming into this, I said we probably like the story for a lot of the same reasons. And you led with what I expected, right? This whole idea of, again, these principles of Superman that the book is able to capture. What surprised me more than anything, because I guess from everything I had heard about it, I kind of figured it would do that, right? Like I've seen enough people posting panels and things from this. Like, okay, like I had a sense, okay, it's gonna be one of those stories, and that's wonderful.
Yeah.
But what I was so pleasantly surprised by was the structure of
Yes.
this work,
Hmm.
because it's, yes, in terms of the Superman's quest to save this girl, yes, there is a linear narrative that we're following, but it's really more of a kind of a framing device that it gives us that allows us to
Hmm.
have all of these sequences and set pieces. And a lot of these chapters, or almost all of them, they just kind of start and you're in the middle of something or you're in a new setting. And I mean, just as an example, the issue where Superman and Clark are split in two, right? At the beginning of that
Hmm.
chapter, he's in space. You know why he's in space. You know what he's trying to do. And he's
Hmm.
caught in this electrical storm. And then he's split off. And you get this whole meditation on the dichotomy between Clark and Superman. And what happens if you have the power but not the compassion? What happens if you have the drive but not the ability? They
Yes.
have to come together. So it's this, and it's just like chapter after chapter of setups like that. And I just
Hmm.
thought that the structure of this work just lent itself beautifully to really examining, mining a lot of these kind of core questions and ideas about the character while still following him on his quest. But this was not a plot based story, right? It wasn't
No.
about like, oh, which planet is she on, this or that. It was really just allowing the space to explore these questions. And what was so cool about it was, again, I didn't know that much about it, so I was really able to just immerse myself in it. Each time I started a new chapter, I had no idea what it was going to be, where
Hmm.
we were going, and look, we read so many of these stories. It's, you don't always get that kind of opportunity, right? A lot of
Yeah.
stories, you read the first couple issues and it's like, okay, I kind of have a sense, all right, I know where we're going, and you can kind of call it. But with this, each chapter, I was like, I don't know what's coming next, and it was
Right.
really fun.
I think it was really neat too, with the exception of issue 1 and issue 6. You could read issues 2, 3, 4, and 5 in any order. It didn't matter. It's what I think of Buffy the Vampire Slayer structuring. Each episode is its own thing, but with a running narrative that ties the season together. And you could absolutely do this with this. You could read go from 1 to 5 or 1 to 4 and then 2 straight to 6. It doesn't matter. Um, but those four in the middle, it's so neat that yes, he's going on a quest. He's going to save this little girl, and here's something that either happened in the past that's being related to us, or something that Superman's going through right now. And it's so good. And normally I don't like that kind of thing. I love serialized storytelling. I don't like episodic storytelling, so I don't like sitcoms. But you know, this really, really works for me.
Yes. No, it's really magnificent. Now, of course, I want to go through these individual chapters
Mhm.
and talk about your favorites and everything that comes up in this, but I don't want to leave Woman of Tomorrow uh, sitting out there twisting in the wind for too long. So
Right.
let me just say, Woman of Tomorrow, 8-issue miniseries, of course, again
Mhm.
written by Tom King, drawn by, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering this pronunciation, but Bilquis Evely.
Yeah, I
Magnificent
believe so.
art.
I believe it's Bilquis. Yeah. Bilquis. Yeah.
Amazing, it's just so evocative and immersive, beautiful art. I really enjoyed in both cases, honestly, with Kubert, of
Yeah.
course. But Evely, that was, I was not familiar with her work before, and it was really tremendous. But there, it's kind of interesting because once again, we have this outer space quest.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit of a theme. So these books, I thought, paired nicely together in that respect, at least. But, in that instance, we have this young girl, this peasant girl, daughter of a rock farmer, whose father is murdered out in the field by this agent of the king who's been sent to root out disloyalty among the subjects. And so this girl,
Mm-hmm.
Ruth, sets about this quest to avenge her father and kill Krem, the one who had murdered him in the field, and eventually links up with Supergirl, who was on this world under a red sun to celebrate her 21st birthday by getting smashed. And the only place you
Yeah.
can do that is under a red sun. And so the two of them become these unlikely companions across the stars as they're hunting down Krem, who is joined up with this this ruthless group of invaders and killers, and we follow them from world to world. And I would say that one has more serialization, but
Mm-hmm.
similarly there too, a lot of those. I feel like a lot of that story is designed to allow for similar types of set pieces where you can
Yeah.
have an issue where Supergirl is, out racing that orb, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in the midst of all of this, we have this discussion of her upbringing, her time on Krypton, the trauma she's endured, how that sets her
Mm-hmm.
apart from Superman. So again, a lot of echoes of the stories between each other. I would say definitely one major distinction is with Woman of Tomorrow. I mean, all of the story, right? And what we see of Supergirl is through the eyes of Ruth. So we have this very, very loquacious
Yes, very.
narrator, which might be a little bit much. And I understand if people, if anyone was kind of turned off by that. I've heard from a couple of people who were, so I do get it. But, so that's definitely one major distinction. But how did you kind of, in looking at the two of them together, was there anything that kind of, just big picture, that kind of came to light that, maybe wasn't as clear as you were originally reading them individually when you were looking at the two of them in tandem?
Um, Not really. I mean, it's more cohesive when you read it all together. When you're waiting month to month, you're like, wait a minute, what went on last issue, and why is she on this planet with the green sun again? Oh yeah, and but I just get so lost in the artwork on this one. It's like reading a European science fiction comic. It's so detailed, and it incorporates so many fantasy uh, visual tropes into this sci-fi setting. It's just a wonderful thing to look at, and I really like the narration. It reminds me of something like Alexander Dumas, or something from the late 1900s, with how verbose she is, how loquacious she is, how well spoken she is, but then it'll be intercut with her using like really bad country grammar, which is one of my favorite scenes from the last issue, which I'll talk about when we get to it. But yeah, it's delightful. I like Up in the Sky better, but it is a delightful book.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. I had some reservations about the ending, and we were talking a little bit off mic about it, and I'm excited to get into that. It's not that it ruined the story for me, but
Mhm.
I guess I mean, it did color my view of the whole thing. But I really did enjoy the ride, at least up until that
Mhm.
point. And I really have to tip my hat to the creators because on paper, one of the ways that it's been described, and I think this is accurate, is sci-fi fantasy. And
Mhm.
especially in terms of the peasants and the kings, and Supergirl's on. I know Comet, right? The super
Mhm.
horses in the comics, but it really had there are definitely a lot of those kind of more fantasy trappings. And I have never ever been a fantasy guy. I remember I've probably said this on the show at one point. I remember in high school, in my AP English class in junior year, just towards the end of the year, and I guess the teacher was like, "All right, we're gonna take it easy for now." Decided to show us Lord of the Rings, one of the I think the first movie, which, as you can imagine, took quite a few classes to get through.
Mhm.
And I remember, I remember saying like, "It's like I don't want to watch this." I said, "I don't like this." and she just let me go, which was great. So I
Wow.
ended up with this, ended up with just like a free period for a few weeks. It was great. But
Wow.
that's to say, it's like, you would think that, especially as a high school kid, or but any of people of any age, people love those movies. That it's like to be able to sit there and watch Lord of the Rings would be great. But it's like I've just never been a fan. So the fact that I enjoyed this as much as I did really is a testament to the creators, I have to say.
Yeah, I'm kind of split evenly on sci-fi and fantasy. I don't like fantasy novels too much, but I really like fantasy movies. I saw each of the Lord of the Rings movies at the midnight opening showing. I watch all three of the trilogies. I that's our Thanksgiving tradition is to watch. I weep every time I watch Fellowship of the Rings. My wife's like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "I'm fine. It's so beautiful." And I weep like a baby during half the scenes of Fellowship of the Ring. But I totally get you. I'm much more of a fantasy guy when it comes to books. I like Dune. I like the Foundation series. I like Rendezvous with Rama, stuff like that. But yeah, and especially when you get into really high concept fantasy where it's so far in the future that things have almost a fantasy element with technology being that far along, that's where it gets really really cool. And I think they did a lot of that with this, where it's not in the future, but it's so far out in space, and it's so some of the technology is so far advanced that it looks like magic or looks magical. And they do incorporate some magic into it with the Mordu sphere. So really, really neat high art kind of stuff. I like it a lot.
Yes, like I said, I mean, it worked, for me a lot more than I thought it would. Now, what we haven't mentioned yet, of course, for people who are dialed into this, and that's probably a lot of the audience, people already know this, but it has been announced that one of the films in James Gunn's DC Studios slate is an adaptation of Woman of Tomorrow.
That's going to be amazing. I cannot wait to see what they do with that. I hope it's not animated. I hope it's live action, and I hope they really, really go all out with it. They don't hold anything back. My one concern is that if they adapt the visuals of the brigands, especially the captain in the ship, I don't trust fandom to not take cool looking villains and elevate them, give them like they say on Twitter, too much drip, and and the captain of the brigands is so cool looking and the ship is so cool looking that I just don't want people to go, oh man, those brigands are awesome. Yeah, those brigands are cool looking, but those brigands are terrible.
Yes, they are remorseless, genocidal
Yes.
murderers. So I hear you. I I'm curious. I really am curious. I mean, that was one of the main reasons I wanted to read it and read it now because we have a larger. I have a larger plan for Supergirl down the line on the podcast.
Mhm.
So, for anyone who's like, oh, he's finally talking about Supergirl. Oh, there's a lot more that's coming. But I thought this would be a good way to at least start to talk about the character of Supergirl. And then also because it has been announced that there will be this movie. I yeah, I mean, I think to your point, I mean, if they really, really commit to this, I think it could be quite cool. One
Yeah.
of the things I want to ask you this, and the kind of going back to this whole idea of how King explores trauma and mental health and everything. One of my favorite issues, but it does beg some questions, in Woman of Tomorrow is there's sort of a two issue swing where first Supergirl and Ruth are trapped by that Mordru orb, right? That Krem
Mhm.
has that transports them to the world with a kryptonite sun. So in the first issue, Supergirl has to endure until the sun goes down. And, it's this great bit where she talks about how Superman can only make it 45 minutes and she makes it like
Mhm.
10 hours. And, she's like 45 minutes. What a bitch. Or
Right.
maybe something even worse because there's a lot of there's a lot of censored expletives over the
Yes,
course of
very
this.
much
So
so.
I think my choice was probably cleaner than what she
Probably.
actually intended. Anyway, and then the subsequent issue, once again, Krem tries utilizing one of these orbs, but Supergirl is able to outrace it on
Mhm.
Comet the Super
Comment.
Horse,
Yeah.
and intercut with this sort of impossible race that she's in. We have Ruth talking about Supergirl's upbringing and
Mhm.
her ultimate escape from Krypton, and a lot of that issue talks about essentially the trauma that Supergirl endured that that Kal-El did not, right? Escaping
Mhm.
Krypton as an infant in that rocket, where obviously, as we all know, that Supergirl, Kara, you say Kara or Kara? Where do you land on this?
My brain says Kara. Um, I try to check myself and say Kara because of the show, but I also know that they changed it from Kara to Kara because it sounds, if you say Kara Danvers, it sounds too much like Carol Danvers, and then you're getting into Captain Marvel territory. And so yeah, I get why they changed it. But yeah, my brain says Kara.
My brain says Kara too, and that's what Smallville
Mhm.
says. So we go with that. But for any
Okay,
any
let's do
any
that.
Kara folks, I get you guys.
Mhm.
But so we see over the course, through these flashbacks, Kara seeing the destruction, the initial destruction of Krypton. Then we follow her and the fellow survivors on Argo, floating out there in space, and then folks start dying from the radiation poisoning, and they erect this lead shielding, and then eventually there's this, meteor strike, and people are dying again, and that's eventually when she's sent off in this rocket. And so it's like she's traumatized, like thrice. It's like threefold
Yeah.
levels here. And I guess, I mean, I don't know. What is your reaction to that, especially in terms of needing to, because I understand needing to find ways to make her story different from Superman. I totally get that. Do you feel that this was, the right way to go? I guess maybe we could start there.
I couldn't speak to whether or not it's the right way to go, but I really liked it. That is my favorite issue of the miniseries, both visually and in terms of the storytelling. I like the visual of when Comet is out racing the Mordu globe, and we get that like rainbow effect as like she's going so fast she's leaving the universe, and it reminds me of Wave Rider. And I always like his time rainbows. But yeah, I really like the flashback to her kind of taking the front and center charge of helping Boyster, Argo City, as it's being bombarded by radiation, and she like works her fingers to the bone for like 40 hours straight, and she starts to get groggy from exhaustion, and she slaps herself in the leg with a hammer to wake herself up, and she keeps going, and she helped dig the graves and all this stuff. I like that. I couldn't say why, but I like the fact that it ties in, with the theme of Up in the Sky, that nothing holds an L back, and L keeps going no matter what. And some people say, well, it's only because Superman is so strong that he can do this, but we're showing with Kara, before she ever had superpowers, that she had this indomitable will, and she was going to, even if it was ultimately futile, she was going to do everything she could to try to save as many of her people as possible. That really resonated with me.
No, right on, right. No, that was certainly compelling, and to be honest, I don't really know. I don't really know what my answer is. I mean, maybe I do in the fact that I'm even bringing up the question, but because I did enjoy the issue as I was reading it, but I guess as I was thinking about it later, and maybe this just stems from kind of this weird thing where I love the characters, and so the idea that she had to endure all of this, because the I guess I look at it and I feel like the fact that she knew this world and then
Mm-hmm.
had to part with it. That's sort of gut wrenching enough. The fact that there were sort of like all of these layers of watching people die and going through that. At a certain point, I don't know if it just feels like overkill or puts her in such a traumatized state. And I guess this kind of ties in with the way she's depicted kind of throughout the story, which I didn't necessarily mind, but I was trying to get a sense of, like reading reviews and things like that. And, again, she's, definitely a surlier version of the character in Woman of Tomorrow than we typically see. And, again, that didn't put me off or anything, but just in terms of the characterization, and yes, with the caveat that we're seeing all of this through the eyes of Ruth. So, we have to take it with a grain of salt. We might not have a reliable narrator, but did you did this characterization resonate with you, or did it kind of feel off in any way?
I liked it. I think a problem that Supergirl suffers from is she comes across as kind of generic sometimes. Supergirl hasn't really resonated with me since Matrix, since Roger Stern was writing her in the early 90s. This really stood out. and I know the Rebirth comics were trying to do parallels to what was going on in the TV show. That honestly got kind of boring to me. This more, I don't know if cynical is the right word for it, because she's still hopeful. She's still, optimistic, but she has that like kind of rougher edge about her that comes from her traumatic early, her teenage years on Argo City. I liked it. I think it made her stick out. I think having her in space really works, because as long as she's on Earth, she's always going to be in Clark's shadow. Out here, I like her as a cosmic character, not policing the universe, but just going around problem solving throughout, the cosmos or whatever. I think that's a really, it's a really interesting way to set her apart from Clark.
Yes. No, for sure. And I think, and maybe that helps explain why this will be the basis for the upcoming Supergirl movie, right? Because,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in the comics and other media, but I feel like, especially with the films and everything, you want to try to set them apart as much as you can. And so this definitely creates an opportunity for something like that. So again, I remain a little bit mixed on kind of leaning so heavily into the trauma that she endured as a way to separate her. But I think one of the things that did resonate and that really jumped out at me was, and I'm trying to kind of call to mind specific instances of this. I guess one would be one of the issues where one of the brigands has been captured, and the you know the civilization that they're with at the moment, they stone him to death, and Supergirl is maybe not an active participant throwing a rock, but she is an observer. She lets this happen, right?
Yeah. That was the one thing that kind of took me out of the story. That I don't know. Um I don't see a member of the House of L letting being on the side of the death penalty, basically. That maybe it was a, in the moment thing, and she had just seen the records of all this trauma of everything that had happened, and maybe she was just a moment of stress, but that was a little jarring for me.
Fair enough. I hear you. That didn't bump me that much. And I guess kind of going back to what I was saying, I it was interesting because in a moment like that, and then there's another instance where I think Ruth is asking her about, do you hate anyone? Something about, right? Is this ringing
Mhm.
right about hate? And
Yeah, yeah, it's right at the very end. Yeah, I think it's the last issue. She says, "Do you hate the brigands?" And Supergirl said, "I'm Supergirl. I don't hate anyone." And that was, the first time I knew that Supergirl lied to me, or something like that.
thank you. And
Yeah.
so I guess that's what I keep coming back to, which I do think is interesting. That I feel like there are certain, it's funny because you're talking about in terms of the House of L, and so maybe that undermines my argument, but I guess in terms of differentiating Clark and Kara, this whole idea that there may be certain values, certain ideals, certain kind of morality that has sort of been thrust upon her as a
Mm-hmm.
member of the Superman family who bears the same crest as her cousin, but that she doesn't necessarily, subscribe to. And so I guess in an instance like, standing by for the stoning, I mean, yes, that's a pretty, jarring instance of that. But that remark to Ruth as well, really kind of got me thinking about that as, again, she kind of falls in line with
Mm-hmm.
Clark, but that these might not necessarily be the exact values that she follows. And what sort of inner conflict does that create? So, that aspect of it I found particularly interesting.
Yeah, it almost, I know you don't like fantasy, but in terms of like D&D alignments, Clark is lawful good. Kara in this one maybe somewhere between neutral good and chaotic good. Um, but yeah, um, and then I lost the thread of what I was going to say after that. But yeah, it's almost like when she says she doesn't hate Krem or the brigands, it's like there's an ideal she wants to live up to, but she doesn't exactly feel it. So she's, faking it till you make it. And she wants to not hate people, but she can't bring herself to not hate these people that have wiped out civilizations and tortured people for fun. And I get it. we all, we may want to live up to the ideal of Superman, but it's a hard ideal to live up to. And, sometimes you slide and sometimes you have to go with your actual real gut feeling. And yeah, I would almost say Supergirl is the more relatable character in this comic. And then Clark is the ideal that we try to strive for.
So let's jump back to that ideal and let's jump back to Up in the Sky. Not that we're done with Woman of Tomorrow, but I do want to get a little more specific about these individual chapters here. So
Mhm.
maybe that's a fun place to start. What's your, right? Maybe you said it before, but your favorite one of the 12?
My favorite of the one is the race with the Flash, and not because of the race, but because of Alice's narration. Where this isn't a thing that's happening in real time. This is a memory that Alice is relating to her captors to explain why she knows that Superman is coming to get her. And she's talking about how, and I agree with this. The Flash should win a race against Superman. Flash is the fastest person alive. He taps into the Speed Force, but Superman wins. And that's a contradiction. And can I read this little bit that Alice
Sure.
says in this? And I can't promise I'm not going to cry a little bit. This is the one page that Superman doesn't actually appear on in the whole story. She's talking about how it's a contradiction that Superman could win, and and how everyone's getting upset. But she says, but I knew something they didn't know. See, people don't think about things in straight ways sometimes, but I do. I think it's because I've been kind of like hurt a lot. My parents, they weren't so nice, and some of those homes I've gotten hurt there a lot too. The home I was in then wasn't very good. It was one of those. And when you're hurt a lot, but you still have to be doing whatever you learn to do something about contradiction and about Superman. And then she goes on about how, Superman is a walking contradiction because he shouldn't be able to do all these things, but he does. And growing up with parents whose first priority weren't always my well-being, I can relate with Alice in this a lot, and it's one of the reasons I like Superman so much. So yeah, every time I read that issue, I kind of tear up a little bit. But yeah, that is the most moving issue story of the trade for me.
No, beautifully said. And I gotta say, and I've said this a lot of times on the podcast. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about who would win in a race, and I don't necessarily find those kinds of debates or stories particularly interesting. And I've always sort of landed on the side of, well, of course it's Flash, it's his one thing, and so on.
Hmm.
So I feel like this story kind of had a, had to do a lot in order to win me over,
Yeah.
and it did.
Hmm.
The idea that Superman overhears Lex, right? Calling the charity and promising to match the funds if Superman wins, right? But he doesn't want it known until after the fact, until after Superman loses, so that he knows he deprived these kids the opportunity to have this money from Luthor. But of course, Clark is always listening for Lex. So he hears this. And that is enough to push him over the edge, right? To just give
Hmm.
him that last surge in order to win. And again, in fairness to Flash, it's like, Flash didn't, wasn't, I guess, similarly motivated. And I kind of took this as this wasn't something, Clark could do every day. But in
Right.
those extreme circumstances, he could rise to that occasion. And I
Hmm.
just thought it was absolutely tremendous. And while we're on this subject of who would win, when Superman is flying Alice home in the final issue, and I know there's more we'll talk about
Yeah.
there, but Alice is asking him all these questions. And one of the ones is, who would win in a fight, you or Batman? And he goes, Batman, because I'd let him win.
Yes, I love
because
that.
because it would mean more to him.
Hmm.
And I just thought that was pitch perfect, right? It's kind
Yes.
of, I know I've quoted the line from Batman v Superman that I know divides a lot of people, but the whole bit of, if I wanted it, you'd be dead already. But it's true. But
Right.
this was, I
It's true.
But I thought this was such a lovely, I guess, more positive, more heartwarming spin on it,
Yes.
where, it's like I would let him because it would mean that much to me. And Superman is humble, right? He's not a
Mhm.
prideful man. It's not he doesn't need to win for the sake of it or because of how it looks in anyone's eyes, right? He's that's really of no concern to him. So I thought, again, in terms of these questions of who would win, and again, in the case of Flash, you actually see it play out. But
Mhm.
I just thought those were such great bits.
Yeah, and he says, "Batman's been through a lot. He needs something to make him happy."
Yeah.
It's so cute. It's so nice. And if if it was phrased even slightly different or said in a slightly different tone, it would come across as condescending, but it doesn't. It really comes across as genuine. Like, I want Batman to feel good. Okay.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think across all of these chapters, and when I was saying before about how I think you see Superman in a relatable manner. I mean, yes, of course, he's in these extreme otherworldly situations,
Mhm.
but ultimately his greatest power, and again, this is a very obvious statement, right? And we know this in our hearts and we see it play out in the story, but still, just for the record, his greatest power is that unwillingness to give up, right?
Mhm.
You mentioned before you might tear up when you're reading that page. I'll probably tear up because I'm going to start talking about Rocky. We have we have the third chapter here, right? Is this boxing match, this outer space
That is my
boxing
second
match,
favorite. That's my second favorite story, by the way.
where he's made this deal with this guy
Yes.
Mito to get information about where Alice has been taken, and the guy's challenged him to this boxing match. And I mean, it's just round after round, and these guys are pummeling each other. And Superman's up against the ropes, and at one point, his corner men, they're like, "Hey, you throw in the towel," and he's like, "Did I get the girl? Then no, the job's not done yet."
Mhm.
And it builds to this realization on his opponent's part of like, oh, this guy is just not going down. And so he eventually drops to his knees because he knows the inevitable outcome of this, that he will eventually tire and give out, but Superman will not fall until
Yeah.
he's accomplished what he's needed to. And again, I talk about Rocky a lot, but I realize, especially in reading this story, and as things just kind of come into focus, and as I get a little older, it's been a common theme. With Superman, it's not always necessarily stated as explicitly as it is in the Rocky movies, where you get these these great speeches, and I've really held on to those a lot over the years. But in Rocky Balboa, in particular, which is my favorite of the franchise, Rocky has this very famous, very standout moment, the speech to his son, where he says, "It's not about how hard you hit; it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving
Mhm.
forward, how much you can take and keep moving forward." And even going back to that first Rocky movie, that iconic scene with Adrian before the fight where they're lying on the bed. I promise I won't go on too long about this.
That's okay.
He says that all he knows he can't win. Like going into that fight with Apollo, he's like, I know I can't win, but if I can just be standing when that, I'm going to tear up. If I could just be standing when that bell rings, like I'll prove it to myself and I'll prove to everyone I wasn't just some bum from the neighborhood. I had
Right.
what it takes to go the distance. And so, I think about those Rocky movies a lot. They've been tremendously inspirational, but I see, especially as I've been revisiting and exploring my Superman fandom, those themes there too. And in full display in this particular story, where he does not give in, Superman, and he does not give up. And that's the relatable aspect, or what hopefully will be relatable for people or inspirational. This
Yeah.
idea that, we've talked in other episodes about, showing up and being there, and that's a big part of it. But it is being able to take those hits, because there are so many things on a day-to-day basis that will absolutely knock you out, and it's really easy to give up. And it's not always big things. I feel, it's like little things. Maybe you stop trying, in certain
Yeah.
areas, right? Because of, discouragement, or, not getting the results that you want. Going back to my documentaries, I think about this all the time. I've been fortunate. My films have played at a bunch of film festivals. You know how many I've been rejected from? A lot, like a lot more than they've ever played at. And it'd be really easy when you get those rejections to just be like, oh man, like I'm not good at this. Like I got to stop. Like it's not worth it. But instead, the lesson that I've tried to take, and thankfully that I've been able to follow, is like you just absorb it and you keep moving forward. And it's like, if you do that over time, in time, you'll get there. So again, I've gone on a lot about this, but it really very powerful, and it's something that I hope really people take to heart. There's this idea of not stopping, not giving in.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk a lot on Truth, Justice, and Hope, and I talk a lot on Twitter about depression. It's something I struggle with just because it's how my brain's wired. And there's always three panels that I use to illustrate pushing back against depression. One is from the 2015 Lois and Clark miniseries, where he's like holding up part of the Earth's crust and just pushing back against it. The second one is from Birthright, where he's got that giant S shield and he's shielding people from it. And the third is from the boxing thing, where he's just standing there with the gloves on and the boxing trunks on and just bloody, and he just says no. That is my all-time favorite. That is because so many people give into depression in a final way, whether that is just giving up on life and just stop moving forward, or not continuing with life, literally, and just telling the forces that push against you, telling, even if it's your own brain that's pushing against you, because your brain is having an imbalance of chemicals, and you have more sadness chemicals than happiness chemicals at the moment. Just telling whatever it is that's haunting you, no, I won't lie down. You won't win. I'm going to keep going. It's going to be a struggle, and you may punch me a lot, but I'm not laying down. And that means a lot to me.
No, beautifully said. No, that's wonderful. That you know, again, you can kind of see all of that play out in these pages, and I love those panels that you say you kind of hold up and look to as examples. I think they're fantastic ones, and striking imagery that kind of in a tough moment can help lift you up and out of it.
Yeah.
Kind of as a preliminary matter, and it's funny because like reading the blurb on the back of the book, they kind of zero in on this, and it is our jumping off point for this story, where in the first chapter, Batman calls Superman in on this missing persons case, right? There were these kids playing, and one of them ends up in the hospital and then later dies, but that's how we learn about this other girl who was taken off world. And there's this initial question of, should Superman leave Earth to try to track her down?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it plays out in that story, and again, it also is kind of explicitly stated on the that blurb there. Just sort of this philosophical debate, like, is it the moral question? Is it appropriate to put the needs of this one life, right, ahead of everyone on Earth who needs Superman? And you get the sense, I don't know that they put an exact time span on this, but he's off world for a decent amount of
A
time.
while, yeah.
Yeah. And even Superman himself is quick to say, I can't do this. Batman pushes back instantly, and he's like, well, I track down people. You just have, you have a larger jurisdiction, right? Like, you're able to go
Right.
into space. So that's what you should do. And, Superman brings in the Green Lantern Corps, but, very quickly gets the sense that, they'll be looking, but there's probably not much that they're going to be able to do. And
Right.
so, of course, as the Smallville fan here, of course, I love the scene with Pa Kent, where Clark is going through, all the reasons why, I really can't do this. It's like, I can't leave the Earth unguarded, and Pa's like, yeah, that's true. And he's like, the Green Lantern Corps, like, they'll look for her. He's like, yeah, that's true. And then Pa's like, but, what if no one finds her? And he's like, the one
Yeah.
thing I learned from you, Clark, is that kids have hope. So what if this little girl is out there and all she has is this idea that someone will save her?
Mm-hmm.
And that's enough. And is that, I mean, does that
Yeah.
justify this sort of, kind of, again, when you're really weighing it, talking about in terms of tactics or strategy, right? Like, it doesn't really compute, but does that solve that
Yeah.
question?
It's the trolley problem. Do
Yeah.
you save this one person that's on the tracks, with the possibility that everyone on the trolley might die? And I there's a meme that I shared that someone put together where Superman's just grabbing the trolley and stopping it. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's not an answered philosophical question. There's in the second story, in the first issue, he gets like this kind of psychic flash of everything that could go wrong while he's gone, and then later on he gets all these. He's just imagining all these terrible things that could be happening to Lois because he's not there to save her, and it's an addressed question. It's not an answered question, and I think that makes the story better because Superman will never sacrifice for the greater good. Superman will help who is in front of him that needs his help. It may lead to political upheaval in Kahndaq or something, but if he's going to stop this person from being hurt, being killed, from being taken advantage of, whatever. And that's what makes the character work. That's why you have counterbalance characters like Black Adam who do see the bigger picture and are willing to sacrifice for the greater good. It creates a kind of a universal balance. These things are there. It's why you have Wonder Woman who's like right in the middle. She will sacrifice for the greater good, but she also does the immediate problem. So this puts Superman very particularly on one end of the scale, and he is perfectly happy, not happy, but perfectly confident being there because that's who he is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, the fact that he doesn't think in those terms, right? Like you said, he helps those who need it, is one of the beautiful things about the character. It's funny, we're here talking about Superman, but I don't know that Batman's advice totally tracked for me, because I feel like Batman would consider, not, I mean, again, Batman telling him to go get the girl. It's not that felt, oh my God, that's so wildly out of character. But I do look at Batman as someone who would consider the sort of the strategy of all of this. Mm-hmm. But again, I think it certainly worked in the context, in the context of this story. You mentioned the issue where, again, he's envisioning all of these terrible deaths befalling Lois in particular, right? As he's stuck in this call center trying to get a call.
It's like the cosmic DMV almost.
Yes, yeah. They keep calling the number, and then he keeps getting the runaround. And I thought that was it was a cool issue because it's there's definitely opportunity for humor there, but at the same time, you really see the toll that it's taking on him, being apart. So I thought that was a strong one too.
Yeah, and that issue is the one that kind of unsettled me the most, especially when you get the splash page of just the Joker and you don't even see Lois, but you have her weak little word bubble from the bottom says, "Clark, please make him stop." It's like, ooh, that's rough. Don't go there with Lois. Don't mess with Lois like that. I can't take it. But yeah, that's especially the way Kubert draws the Joker is really, really just terrifying.
Yes. And going back to what we were just saying about this, again, this moral question, right, of the one versus the many. And not that we're given an answer per se, but I did think it's such a beautiful payoff in the penultimate chapter where this unseen villain, this disembodied voice who's behind the abduction and has created this robot army, right? And Superman's fighting the army out in space while the army is decimating Earth and the heroes of Earth. And once again, Superman refuses to relent and is able to overpower that robot army and take out the ruler. And then we see on Earth, right, our heroes who had been up against the ropes here, are able to win the day because all of the robots now have lost their controller, and they're trying to figure out what happened. Like, what did we do? How did we win? And, Batman, of course, is able to piece together that Superman had a hand in this and took out the one who had been controlling them. And he said, we were in need, and he's Superman. Yeah. And so it's like, even when he's not there, and yes, of course, the big coincidence that the people who were responsible for this ended up attacking him, but not a coincidence, but the fact that, even when he's not there, it's like, he's still with them. So I thought that was a great payoff.
One thing I think that benefits the story from it not necessarily being in continuity, it could be either, or is, there's a show I used to listen to called View from the Gutters, and they talked about Batman a lot. And they said Batman's greatest superpower is the rule of cool. Is that the universe bends itself around Batman to make him look cool. with Superman, it's almost kind of like the Einstein theory of space-time. If you have a dense enough object, space-time bends around this dense enough object. Superman is the dense object in this. Like, reality bends itself a little bit for Superman to do what Superman needs to do. Superman can't beat the Flash, but he did, because he's so determined, so powerful, that he's able to just, and I know they don't explicitly state this in the book that he's bending reality, but it comes across that way, that he's able to just bend reality just a little bit to go that little extra that always needs to be done. And I really enjoy that in like a maybe fan theory, high concept kind of way. But I did want to talk about what you were saying earlier about, Batman telling him to just, follow the clues and investigate. The way Superman investigates, and I'm not a Frank Miller fan by any means, and I recognize that is an extremely misogynistic piece of work. But the way Superman investigates in this is kind of like Marv from Sin City, where he just goes to someone who might have the information. He just gets that information from that person. He's not looking for clues. He's not dusting for prints. He's not putting things in the back and picture like, you know something and you will tell me. And that is the way Superman should investigate, because he's such a straightforward character.
That's a no, that's a great point and a great comparison. And he gets, he gets pummeled a good bit in this, not unlike
Yes.
Marv. So yeah, I think I think the comparison is apt. As far as just sort of going up to people, right, and asking, one of these chapters starts with a deal between Superman and Darkseid, where Darkseid will share the information that he has in exchange for Superman taking an innocent life. And we follow Superman on the story. He uses his super hearing. He finds this alien being who's praying for death, who's sick and dying. And we get to this point where we see Superman with a knife over this person, and then we cut away and we come back to Superman and Darkseid, and we eventually get the answer, right, later on, that Superman did not kill this person, but rather found a cure for the disease, because maybe bending reality, right? Like, he's Superman. He always finds a way.
Right.
But the conversation with Darkseid, where Darkseid says, like, did you do it? Like, basically, like, I don't know if you did it or not. And Superman's like, well, because Darkseid's whole thing, he wants to see a hero fall, right? He wants this, like, this corruption of Superman. And Superman's like, well, if I killed, then you got what you want. And if I didn't, then I broke my word and you still got what you want. And that called to mind All-Star Superman to me, and sort of that unanswerable question, like, what happens when the immovable force, meets the unstoppable, or the unstoppable force meets the immovable object? Just sort of the way of kind of reconciling those two things, and in this deal with the devil, it called that to mind for me.
Yeah, that story worked for me on two levels, and one of them is so good that you don't get the payoff of it for later. Like you said, where he's talking the Darkseid, it shows that his commitment to his word and to the truth is as important to him as his commitment to protecting all life. And two, I'd forgotten about the ending where we see that he found a cure for the guy. As I'm reading this, I'm having like the moral debate with myself. What's more important? If this person is dying and they're suffering and they want to die, is it better to stick to your commitment to life, or is it better to stick to your commitment to helping people? And at the time I was like, well, honestly, taking it out of context, a person suffering from an incurable disease, in my opinion, has the right to die in their own terms. But then you get to the end of the trade, and you're like, oh, he went option C, which I didn't, was not even on the table. He completely subverted it. He again, like the meme with the trolley problem. He didn't save the one person. He didn't save everybody on the trolley. He stopped the trolley. And like, that just, I'd read it before. I hadn't read it in a couple of years. I read it again, and it blew my mind. I'm like, oh yeah, of course he did. And it's great.
Yeah, it's once again doing the impossible, right? He shouldn't be able to beat the Flash in a race, but he does. Again, not unlike All-Star Superman, where you saw him performing his 12 labors. Similarly here, you get this kind of, and look, in All-Star Superman, he cured disease. So,
Yeah.
you get certain shades of that where he's performing these. I mean, to begin with, as a threshold matter, he's impossible. But even
Mhm.
like even suspending our disbelief, there's this being from Krypton who has these abilities. Even
Right.
within that context and that suspension of disbelief, he's doing things that are so impossible. And in the end, I think it's appropriate and right, and I
Mhm.
think the story is better for it.
Yes.
There's a part of me as I was reading this where I said to myself, I don't know that I needed the reveal later that he had cured the guy. Because I thought it was, I really liked the way it played with Darkseid, where we don't
Yeah.
know.
Mhm.
But at the same time, there is, like you said, like you wouldn't have necessarily entertained option C. He cured the person, right? And once you get that, it's, I guess, that's what makes him Superman. So,
Right.
so again, I like the way it went, but there was, as I was reading it, when we were done with that, you know what it was? When we were done with that chapter, and again, I'm reading this for the first time, I thought, oh, what
Mhm.
a, kind of what an interesting, clever choice to end with that little bit of ambiguity there, right? Like
Yeah.
leave a little bit of room for interpretation here. So I guess when we got the definitive answer to it, I kind of felt like, oh, it was kind of cool to leave a little bit of room there. But
Yeah.
all in all, especially for this kind of story, this was the right
Mhm.
choice.
Yes. Absolutely agree. That's a lot of yes. Sorry, I lose words sometimes when I think about this book. It's so just heartwarming. It breaks your heart in one moment, and then it lifts you right back up in the next. And it's a this book is an absolute roller coaster.
It really is. We've mentioned now a couple of times. You've mentioned particularly the trolley problem, and it's funny because we just did an episode last week on Superman Space Age, where
Mhm.
that whole ethical dilemma is a recurring theme in the book, and you get Superman's response to it, which is I would just save everybody, and versus Batman's response, and there was another echo of Space Age. Obviously, I know this book came out years earlier, but in that issue, Man and Superman, where they split in two, right? And so
Mhm.
they're on this world, and Superman just wants to call it and go, right? And Clark is determined to find this girl. And again, you get, like we said before, what each one brings to the table here. And at the end, as Superman is carrying flying Clark up back into that storm to hopefully be struck again and merge,
Mhm.
he says they talk about hope. And that was another theme in Superman Space Age. Like what is hope, right? The lie that we make come true, like what hope
Yes.
allows us to do. And here, similarly, again, a few years apart, these stories, but reading them together, it's like, oh, you see these echoes where Superman says hope is a myth used to motivate men to do what they cannot. And Clark's like, hey, pal, you say that like that's a bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah,
Love it.
that story is really neat. It's really neat visually. The way the Kal-El version was depicted, it's almost his suit is almost reminiscent of the Injustice suit, which I think is the more armor you put on Superman, I think it's become a good visual shorthand for maybe a less ethical version of Superman. And Clark in that story is really funny too. And like the Kal-El is like such a stiff, and he's like all business, and yes, I am the champion and I must go. But Clark's like, well, why don't you just let me alone? Let me eat my alien elephant.
Yeah.
It's really, I don't know. King is a King is a really good writer. At least when it comes to dialogue, his dialogue is amazing.
Yeah, it was good. It's funny that more armored look. Injustice is a perfect call. I was thinking Eradicator a little bit more with those,
Oh yeah.
over the shoulder sort of thing. But yeah, I thought that was great. And again, just this idea of hope and how they could both
Mhm.
look at it kind of the same core idea, but from different perspectives, right? As a positive or as a negative. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, that's, that unwillingness to relent, to surrender, to give up. But I guess ultimately, if we really were to boil it down even further, what his greatest power is, right? Is that hope, right? That belief that things will work out. And again, by not giving up, you can achieve that. Absolutely tremendous. What did you think of the Easy Company issue where once again we're just plucked in the middle of this, right? Where
Yeah.
we're with Sergeant Rock and all that, and they find Superman and they put him in in his army uniform, and it takes until the end of the chapter until he regains his memory and all of that. But that was a fun
Um,
one.
I liked it. Like you said, it was fun. The story doesn't uh, need to tell us how Superman got shot back in time to be stuck with Sergeant Rock and all that. But yeah, it's good, and I like the end where Superman tells Sergeant Rock, "Thank you for saving the world." That's really good. You know, I was a big fan of All Star Squadron when I was a little kid, and that was always a big theme there that the superheroes couldn't go win World War II because of like a story contrivance that they'd made up. But yeah, it's not my favorite story of the bunch, but good one, a fun one.
Yeah, I think it was fun being in that setting, but I think ultimately what I found most worthwhile was just that parting between
Mhm.
Superman and Sergeant Rock, where Rock is thanking him, and he's like, "No, thank you," and that
Yeah.
ties in with that other chapter where Superman's injured out in space, and he's brought into
Mhm.
that healer who heals Superman as much as he can, but it's not enough. But in the process, he creates this mental link, right? And then this alien is able to experience what Superman has experienced and to see everything he's done and everything he's capable of. And one of the ideas that comes forth in those flashes he's seeing, right, is Superman talking about how much the people have inspired him.
Mhm.
And this healer in turn is inspired to sacrifice himself to
Yeah.
save Superman. I thought that was a powerful one.
That was the hardest issue for me. Not that it wasn't a good issue. It was really, really well done. But looking at it, from a husband, from the perspective as a husband and a dad, I couldn't do that. Even if it was Superman, I couldn't leave my wife and my kid like that. And it just, I think it maybe intentionally shows us our shortcomings of what we will and what or won't able to do. That definitely showed me mine. My family always comes first, no matter what. Um, but yeah, it's a very touching story, definitely.
This is a little tangent, but like I've been dying to talk about it, and it's very current, and I'll try to avoid spoilers. But we were talking off mic. I know you're current on Superman and Lois,
Mhm.
and again, I don't want to spoil too much, but people have probably at least gleaned the broad strokes of the season where Lois is dealing with a major health issue. We'll kind of leave it there. And in the most recent episode, and people will be hearing this just a week after the episode aired, so really the most recent episode, uh, there's this whole question posed by the boys about, why hasn't Clark used the Fortress technology, Kryptonian tech, to try to help Lois? And, you know, Clark and Lois eventually address this with the boys at the end of the episode. And Clark talks about how if it were able to be done, it wouldn't be fair to not share that with the rest of the world, but essentially that the implications of sharing Kryptonian tech would be too dangerous. So
Yeah,
we're not even doing it.
yeah,
Then look, we're only a few episodes into this. Well, about halfway into the season, and so we'll see how it all plays out. But I had a really hard time with that.
yeah. I agree. I think they should have just left it at, we don't think it will cure her because she's human and this technology is intended for Kryptonians and it would probably kill her. Um, I think once they got into like, well, why? And it goes like back to the World War II issue. Like, well, why didn't the superheroes go save World War II? Well, like, well, why wouldn't you use Kryptonian, technology to cure cancer? Because that would be insulting to people in real life. And yeah, that I think they should have just not touched on that in the show. I think they should have left it as, because it won't work. And just, yeah.
I agree. That's the thing. Because I feel like, yeah, I mean, I get why you wouldn't. Again, like you said, out of respect for people who are
Mhm.
actually going through this, like you wouldn't necessarily go that route, right? And then we don't have a season. Like they're mining a lot from the storyline, but to have it expressly articulated in that way, it just didn't ring true that
Yeah.
Superman. Because especially Lois, right? I mean, I would
Mm-hmm.
include the boys, in that as well. It's like they're the exception. It's like he would do anything. But then I also say to myself, and I'm it's like psychoanalyze myself so much, but I I do think about this sometimes where I guess I I guess there's a part of me that likes the idea that my morality and Clark's morality align. And so
Mm-hmm.
when I run into an instance like this, I guess I bristle at a little bit, and I say to him, and I guess my instinct is to be like, well, it's a misstep on the show's part, right? Like that Clark wouldn't
Yeah.
do it because I wouldn't feel that way. I
Yeah.
would do anything in my power if that were my life. Anything. It wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
There's no deal I wouldn't make. There's nothing I wouldn't do. And so it's like, of course, Superman would do the same. So, yeah, but I don't know. Like sometimes I do have to check myself. And look, when we get into the larger questions about, should Superman kill? Would he kill in certain instances? I mean, I think there too, I run into that a little bit as well because I think of instances where I would, and I don't think it would bother me all that much in certain circumstances, extreme
Right.
circumstances. So when we're shown these instances where Superman will not kill under absolutely any circumstance, like, well, I don't. But is it that's not
Yeah.
what's right for the character, or is it just that that's not how I see it, and I need to see myself the same as Superman? I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Again, it's back to the bending reality. It's like, you know, end of Man of Steel. Was it the right move to snap Zod's neck? Yes, absolutely. Is that what you want to see Superman do? No. But like you said, going back to Injustice, I, I don't like the idea of Injustice. I don't like the idea of a Superman that goes bad. But something happens to my wife and kid. That's my supervillain origin. I guarantee right there. So I can kind of see what the temptation is to do something like that with the character, but it's just not what I want to see from Superman. And yeah, it is jarring when the character you aspire to, you realize, I'm here trying to be like Superman. Superman's still way up here. I've got a long way to go before I'm going to get to that. And I probably won't ever be able to because, reality doesn't bend around me.
Right. But I guess that's the idea when we're talking about these iconic idealized figures, right? I guess
Mhm.
there always has to be that bit of space there.
Yeah.
But we touched on it before, but the final chapter where Superman is flying Alice home and she's just asking him all these questions. Like we talked about the Batman question. I mean, what was your take on this chapter generally? Which of the questions or answers stood out to you the most? Was there anything that went unasked that you wished had been addressed?
Not as far as but was being when asked. The one that sticks out to me the most is the religion question. And I think the way they handled it was really, really smart. For anyone that hasn't read it, Alice asked, "Do you believe in God?" And I think the quick answer is like, "Yeah, I've met him." But I think the question should be like, "Do you worship God?" Because Superman's met the presence. He's worked alongside Azrael and the Spectre, and he's fought Zariel, not Zariel, Asmodel. Um, but he says, Ma and Pa believed, and I believe in Ma and Pa. And she says, well, what should I believe in? And he said, basically said, you should believe in hope. That's a really, really smart way to handle it because any way he answers that is going to make somebody mad. A devoutly religious person would come back with, well, Superman was raised Methodist or Presbyterian or whatever. So, and he was raised in the Midwest with staunch Midwestern values. Of course, he would grow up to be Christian. Someone like me, they're like, well, yeah, Superman's met God. That doesn't mean he worships God. And he's widened his perspective since he was a kid. So I think that was a perfect, someone could say, almost political, politician-y answer. He didn't answer it one way or the other, but he gave enough to make both sides happy.
Yes. Well said. Yeah, I thought that was handled great. Though the one that I guess I found most amusing and I thought was perfect as well is when Alice is asking him about Lex
Oh,
and about, did you make him go bald? And he's like, he thinks I did. And, why does he hate you? He's like, well, he thinks I'm limiting humanity's potential. And she's like, but it's really about the ball thing, right? And she's like, yeah, probably.
Probably. The other one that cracked me up is when she asks, "Well, how do you fly?" And he goes into, he's like, "Well, I create this field and it pushes lots of things." Like, well, it doesn't it have to push off of something? Yeah. Well, what does it push off of? Oh, it's complicated. And then she's like, "Do you shoot rocket rays out of your butt? You can tell me. I won't tell anyone." I thought that was very, very little kid answer. Very, Alice is probably 10. That's a very 10-year-old kind of question.
Yes. But of course, the ultimate payoff to this story, the question that she doesn't ask because she doesn't need to ask, is why would he drop everything and
Mm-hmm.
leave this planet that he's sworn to protect for this one child? And she doesn't need to ask because she knows the answer. She's had the answer all along because he's Superman. And that's the
Right.
note we end on. And
Absolutely.
it really, again, really, this story really boils it down to the essence of the character. It's funny going back to the beginning. I meant to say this when we were talking about kind of the Walmart of it all, and just kind of the jumping off point. I think one of the other reasons why I never really moved quickly on this was I had the mistaken impression, the misconception that this was going to be, I mean, for lack of a better term, like more of a kiddie book. I guess because
Yeah.
I looked at it as, oh, it's going to be in Walmart. Like I didn't know exactly what audience. I mean, the non-comics initiated, right?
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, I didn't know exactly what the objective with this was, and what angle it would take. And I really thought, even though I knew the creators involved, but I guess I thought this was going to be more disposable, to be honest,
Yeah,
right?
I
And
agree.
so I think that was one of the reasons why I was like, this is not a priority. And so once again, I was just kind of blown away by how meaningful and how significant this was. And to your point, this does really thread the needle beautifully because he's with Lois, and Pa's still alive, and so there are certain things that you could kind of point to be like, oh, it could fit in here, but it also could work outside as well, and
Yeah.
that's you know there's a reason, like, this is one of those stories you can just hand to anyone. And I would imagine any comic shop would be one of those books that you kind of always have and you would always want to have. It works great.
Yeah, and I think they slotted it in just right because I think this came out after Doomsday Clock had wrapped up, where Pa gets brought, Ma and Pa are alive again, and man, I can't wait to talk about Doomsday Clock on my show. um, and it's he's got the relationship with Lois. They're very obviously together, but you could read it as Lois dating Superman, in a Silver Age or All Star kind of way, and yeah, it's you can put it anywhere in Superman's continuity, just about, not including maybe the New 52, and you've got a perfectly legitimate Superman story for that era.
Absolutely. We can circle back for final thoughts on Up in the Sky, but I want to jump back to Woman of Tomorrow. I guess let me just toss it to you first. And we don't need to go issue. I know we got pretty specific with Up in the Sky. We essentially, I think we went through just about all of the chapters there.
Right.
We don't have to get that nitty gritty with Woman of Tomorrow, but where would you like to go next on that front? What did you want to talk about with respect to that
On
one?
with Woman
With
of Tomorrow, or with Woman of Tomorrow. Like I said, I am captivated by this artwork, and sometimes I kind of forgot what the story was because I got so into the artwork. Like the way Everly draws eyes just draws me in. Everyone's got these big, amazing eyelashes. Even Comet has big, amazing eyelashes, and everything has this almost dreamlike quality. There's elements of the Muppets thrown into it. There's elements of like Dr. Seuss thrown into it. It's just this truly almost surreal journey that you go on with Supergirl, or more accurately, that you go on with Ruthie as she's observing Supergirl doing what Supergirl does. And as far as the plot goes, the plot is very, very basic, but it's more about Ruthie's journey than Supergirl's, honestly, and how she goes from you know absolutely wanting to kill this guy that killed her father, to to learning a sense of mercy through observing the example of Supergirl, and still, being able to acknowledge that someone is repentant for their actions but still not forgiving them, which is a complex place to be. So it's a interesting moral question of a story.
Yes. So a couple of things, and that kind of points us to the end where, like I said, it's kind of where it lost me a little bit. I think there's some room for interpretation. We were talking off mic. What do we think the end means? And I think, people can kind of derive different conclusions from this. But, ostensibly as we're making our way through this story, right? Again, Ruthie's hell bent on revenge, and Supergirl ends up intervening, and that's how they link up. But the reason that we're all told that they stay together on this quest to find Krem is that Krypto is shot with a poison arrow on this red sun planet and receives care. But in order to fully save Krypto, they need the person who fired that poison arrow, right? To try to find out exactly what poison concoction was used so that they can cure the dog. And Supergirl doesn't really know what Krem looks like. That's why she needs Ruthie. That's why they have to go together. And, as you're reading this, and again, even reading this for the first time, I figured something was up because we're told many times weeks are passing, months are passing. It's like, well, okay, either there's going to be some twist that allowed Krypto to be saved, or that wasn't really the reason why they had to go on this quest together. And sure enough, we do ultimately get, when we get to the climax of the story, this revelation on Supergirl's part that Krypto's okay, right? That's not why they've been together, but she knew that Ruthie would not give up this bloodlust, this thirst for revenge, right? Mm-hmm. Until she had learned that that's not the right path. I guess maybe that's a good place to kind of pause. What was your reaction to that, to that revel? I don't know how surprising or not it felt to you, especially as you were reading for the first time, but surprise or not, how did you kind of take that piece of it?
I don't know. I think I kept forgetting about Krypto as the story went along. I think because they bring up Krypto in like maybe every other issue. So I'd be reading along. It's like, oh yeah, Krypto's still back on the planet. Krypto's still poisoned. Wait, how long has Krypto been poisoned? And they don't mention it. And it's like, okay, we got to find Krem. Oh yeah, don't forget about Krypto. And then they not talk about Krypto for a while. So honestly, by the time it gets brought up, I'm like, oh yeah, oh that makes sense that she was just lying about Krypto. It's like I was saying earlier, we're showing a different end of the spectrum of good. Clark is the goodest good that you can good. Kara in this one is doing good while maybe bending some ethical principles for the sake of doing good. And I think that goes a long way to making Kara not one dimensional and to making her stand out from Clark. Because Clark had this relatively perfect upbringing, and that's why he's as good as he is. And some people said, well, like in All Star, at the end where Lex says, well, oh, this is why you're so good, because you can see the things that connect all of this. This shows it's not just about the powers, it's about what you go through as a kid. And Supergirl is, she's still incorruptible in her goodness, but she's willing to do things that Clark might not to achieve that good.
Absolutely. Well, actually, that's a good question. Do you see? I don't know that I could foresee a scenario where Clark would take someone, although, yeah, I guess would he even have gone to that point? But the idea of like trying to impart a lesson, trying to help, trying to
Yeah.
See it through with the person, I could see him doing that. But I
I
definitely
could see him doing it with a smirk on his face, but never actually lying. Just not ever like he said, he never told Darkseid whether or not he killed the guy. He just said, well, I either lied or I killed him, and either way you win. He never said, so I could see him like just not giving all the facts.
Yes. And you know what? I'll say this. I mean, even if you can foresee a scenario where you could sub Superman here and for Superman, like this was Supergirl was the far better vehicle, for this
Yeah.
kind of
Oh
story.
yeah,
But
definitely.
yeah, that's sort of that quote unquote twist. But again, it definitely tracked, and especially keeping in mind the timeline in crypto, it's like it kind of had to be this way, otherwise the implications for crypto would be quite dire. So I'm certainly glad they didn't go they didn't go that route.
I
One of the
do
criti
wonder if that was the intention from the beginning, or if King just wrote himself into a corner.
Yeah, I wonder. I did see, and kind of like looking up reviews and things like that. One of the criticisms, the violence against animals. Crypto's
Mhm.
shot with the arrows, and then of course the Comet sacrifices himself for Kara as well. So there's that piece of that as well. Obviously, never like to see an animal hurt or in
Yeah.
distress. I'm glad Crypto at least was okay. But the idea that Supergirl kind of knew the road that this young girl was going down and wanted to
Mhm.
set her straight and get her to see that there's a better way and to let go of this. I really thought that was a great moment and a great payoff. And you see that it worked in that moment, at least on the beach where Krem is, he's tied up and Ruthie, sets him down and they have this whole battle and he's, on his knees and he's done and he's defeated. And all that's left is for her to deliver that killing blow. And she just can't do it. It's like swing after
Mhm.
swing after swing. She just can't do it. And then that's when Supergirl arrives and offers to kind of finish the job for her. So what was
Mhm.
your reaction to that piece of it?
Um, when I read it, it's like, okay, how is this going to play out? And I like the resolution of it. I like that according to Ruthie's narration, because we see later that Krem has been. I I assume it's supposed to be the Phantom Zone, but then people don't age in the Phantom Zone, so I don't know. But we see that Krem's been stuck in some kind of space prison forever, and Ruthie says that she told everyone in her book that Supergirl killed Krem. But what we're seeing is something different. But I guess it could be, which one is the real truth. But yeah, I'm glad Supergirl didn't. I read it as Supergirl didn't kill Krem, and I wouldn't want her to have. But they do set it up where she was okay with watching someone be stoned to death. So it is ambiguous.
Yeah, I mean, I took it as true what we see in those final pages where again, Supergirl and Ruth they have this reunion years later and again the retrieval of Krem from I agree, it's funny, I hadn't thought about the fact that you wouldn't age in the Phantom Zone. So I don't because
Yeah,
it seemed pretty clear that that's where he had been, but then that's true. That does kind of throw a little bit of a wrench in the work. So I don't know, but he was somewhere but I think they even say Phantom Zone. But in any
I
event,
think they do. Yeah, they do say Phantom Zone.
he was a place where he was rehabilitated, right? Like he learned the error of his ways and he repented and he changed and he became a model citizen and all of that and he spit out here. I mean, I guess going back to that moment on the beach where Supergirl takes the sword, yeah, I agree. I don't think in the moment that she killed him. I think what we see in that little epilogue is what actually happened. So, I'm that tracks in my head, but even just the act of taking the sword and this notion of I wanted you to learn this lesson, but
Hmm.
I haven't learned it, right? Or I can't come to terms with this, right? Because Ruth had asked her earlier about I forget the exact line. You might have it more top of mind, but in the context of Krypton, right? And she says something like, "Do you wish you had avenged Krypton?" Right? It was something to that effect,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Something like that. Yeah. Do you wish you could have gotten revenge for Krypton? She's like, well, there was no one to get revenge on. But the as far as Supergirl picking up the sword, the way I read that is that was the final test for Ruthie to see if Supergirl is pretending like she's gonna kill Krem, and she's waiting to see if Ruthie will tell her to stop. Because
Okay. Interesting. Okay. And that
Yeah.
might totally be, maybe that was what was intended. You know what's so funny? I think that going back to my whole thing from before about certain values that have kind of been thrust upon her as a member of the
Mhm.
super family that she might not ascribe to, I think that sort of is what I had in my mind, right? And
Oh,
that's sort of, the idea that this lesson she wanted to impart, but it's one that she hasn't totally adopted herself, is kind of in line with, that track that I was on.
right.
But I like what I
Yeah.
don't,
'Cause
and this,
I like the idea that Ruthie can't do it herself, but Supergirl is still wanting to see if Ruthie wants him to die, even if she can't bring herself to do the act.
right. Yeah. And that's when, and we get, that whole sort of montage, right? From Ruthie talking about, I learned the lesson and I learned it when you taught me how to wash my hands on
Mhm.
the ship and when, you didn't give up here and when you dug the graves on that planet over there, and she sort of goes through a lot of these key moments that clearly made an impression on her. So, I mean, I can totally see, kind of that interpretation that you were laying out. Although, it's funny, I was pulling it up on my phone, just on the DC app and kind of scrolling through those last pages. And I don't know, Kara is in such a kind of detached, despondent state as she's holding
Mhm.
that sword that it, to me, it didn't feel like she was testing Ruthie
Yeah.
so much as she really was having this moment of her own,
That's
at
very
that point.
possible, yeah. Did you read that the comet died? I wasn't sure how to read that.
I took it that he had died.
Okay. That does make more sense. I just read it that he was hurt. Um, but that scene of her, the splash page of her carrying Comet down to the planet with her like tattered cape swirling out behind her and the way her feet were like she's walking on the air, it reminded me of when Peter David turned Matrix into an angel.
Yes.
It's very, very impressive panel.
Yeah, that was really cool. So yeah, so you were a fan of, did you read that whole Peter David series?
No, I don't
No.
like Peter David.
Oh. All right.
His there's some stuff of his that I've liked, but and I liked Matrix when she was just a proto matter shape changer, and I don't know, I don't really like what he did with Matrix in that series, but that's just
Fair,
me.
fair enough. But going back to Kara on the beach here and at the end of Woman of Tomorrow. Yeah, I don't know. I think that in terms of all of the trauma, guilt, grief that she's still carrying over Krypton, coupled with, obviously Ruthie had her reasons for wanting Krem dead, but we've now gotten to the point where Supergirl has seen the carnage wrought by
Mhm.
Krem on world after world after they're visiting all these. I mean, they're, she's helping that, that grave digger, dig all of these graves, including one for his daughter, which is just gut wrenching.
Yeah.
So I think all of that kind of brings her to that point where, uh, where she could potentially do it. But I think Ruthie is able to kind of get through to her, in all of that. So in a way, in the end, they help each other, I suppose. At least I guess that's my reading of it. At least if and until I do my next reading of it.
Yeah, I could see that. It didn't occur to me that Comet had died, but now that Supergirl takes it personally, and like you said, she has this very detached look in her eyes. I could see that, Supergirl was gonna kill Krem, and it was Ruthie that stopped Supergirl at the last second. That makes total sense.
I also have to say, I what I appreciated was you figured at some point when Ruthie confronts Krem, we would get some kind of context, revelation, explanation for what went down between Krem and her father.
Mhm.
And I assumed Krem was going to try to kind of put down her father, try to reveal that he wasn't this good guy, right? Because she's talking about him in this narration as just this honorable, wonderful man. And I thought Krem was going to try to undermine it. Not that it would necessarily be the truth that he's telling her, but
Right.
that's what he would try to do. And instead, it's the exact opposite of that when they finally have that face to face, right? Because
Mhm.
essentially, Krem's whole thing was he would tell a joke, right, at the king's expense, and then based on the audience's response, would know whether or not they were loyal to the king. Uh, and Ruthie's father apparently was just so upset, so offended, right, by this that he took great offense and told Krem to leave and this and that. And so that was a little bit of a reversal of my expectation of how
Yeah.
Krem was going to depict the final moment with the father, and I appreciated that little
Yeah,
reversal.
that was a really neat turnaround. Like you said, I thought it was going to be that, maybe Ruthie's father had some ideas that the king wasn't being as good of a king as he could be, and he was expressing it in a diplomatic way. But Krem was like, no, disloyalty is disloyalty. But yeah, I like the turnaround that Krem just didn't like being told what to do by this rock farmer. Get off my farm. Who are you to tell me what to do? That was really nice. And
Yeah.
it's one of the things that's striking about this to me is that Krem does not look like a villain. Krem looks like a swashbuckling, ne'er do well anti-hero, and then everything he does is just horror upon horror upon horror, and that was a really neat visual subversion of expectations.
Yes. And well, I guess going back to what you were saying before, I think that'll make it interesting when it comes time to bring this character to life on the big screen. Sort of the risk that you could potentially run of people gravitating to this character when
Yeah.
when they shouldn't necessarily. But so we've talked about that climax on the beach, but then we have this epilogue where again we've laid out the setup for it, where Krem is retrieved from the Phantom Zone. Ruth is an old woman now. She has written this book, right, that alleges that Kara had killed Krem to essentially absorb the brunt of the vengeance of the brigands, because otherwise they would come after Ruth. So you have that kind of piece of it, and Krem comes out and he repents, he begs Ruth for forgiveness, and and so that's what all of this has been building toward. And then on that last page, Ruth just cracks him with her cane. What is your
that
read
was
on this final page?
that was probably the most realistic thing in the book. You can have something traumatic happen to you. You can have the person who committed that trauma literally, be completely repentant, feel, I am sorry. I acknowledge this terrible thing I've done. And it's okay to not forgive them. You don't have to forgive your traumatizer. And I appreciated that. I think that is a real world reaction. You know, you can say, yes, I acknowledge that you repent. I acknowledge that you are sorry. I don't forgive you. It's not okay, but I acknowledge that you have at least attempted to make amends.
I don't disagree with that. Was your reading of that scene that the strike from the cane kills Krem on that hill there?
Um, I think it's intentionally ambiguous. I didn't read it as that. I just read it as her just cracking him, knocking him down. But it they don't explore it either way, and you don't get enough visual cues because Krem's body is in silhouette. You see his kind of hand up like this, and his hand upraised, and then you see it fall to the ground. Um, it could be that he was so old and frail that being just hit in the face with a cane killed him. It could be that he just got knocked out.
I agree that there's the room for interpretation. My reading on it was definitely that killed him, but yeah, we don't know for sure. I I don't know. I mean, and then what is your take on Kara's sort of, maybe not apathy, but I mean her lack of any measurable reaction or response to this? I think her arm goes up, for a moment
Right.
there, but that's kind of it, and then they just kind of part ways.
I I don't know. There's because in one hand, you fall, like we've been saying, House of L doesn't kill, House of L doesn't support people being killed. But then you saw Kara not having a problem with one of the brigands being publicly executed. The way I read it is that he was just knocked out, and Kara was like, "Okay, fine, you got your good lick in, one final lick. Let's move on." That was the closure you needed. But it could be that Kara was like, "Well, he was evil, and he deserved to." No, no, I still can't. No, I tried to go that route. I can't see Kara having Krem do penance in the Phantom Zone for that long, and then still thinking it's okay to execute him afterwards. So no, I That's why I don't think he actually died, because I think Kara would have been upset after, like, look, he did his time. He did years and years and years and years and years in the Phantom Zone. You can't have him do his time and then kill him. It's redundant.
Okay. So I agree. That's why, and we talked off mic, and I had tweeted after I finished reading this that like I really enjoyed this. Like I was on board with this ride up until that last page. And that's why, because I mean, I respect your interpretation that maybe he's not actually dead, but man, as I'm looking at it, I just well, not even that there's an objective right or wrong. I mean, unless we ask
Right.
Tom King and he tells us, but like
Right.
my reading of this was like, this guy is dead. And that's why I have a problem with this for all the reasons you just said, because
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I definitely would have a hard time with Kara going along with it. Although, I mean, you can argue, well, she has super speed. I mean, presumably she could have stopped this, but maybe
Right.
she was so taken by surprise. Now, interestingly, Ruth and Kara do walk in different directions. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe, that
That's true.
symbolizes that, she was not aligned with this decision, her kind of just standing by as it's happening again, unless it happens so fast that but I don't know. That's where I think I really kind of have a little bit of an issue with this. And then also, because again, to your point, it's one thing to not forgive. Totally on board
Mm-hmm.
with that, right? Totally on board with that. But if she's now killing him after this penance, after this, repenting, does that not undermine the lesson that she did seemingly learn that she articulated on that beach there?
There's one other possible way to read it, because when Krem is toward the end, where he's tied up on the island, and then he and Ruthie fight, and he's defeated, and he's saying, "Are you expecting me to beg? Are you expecting me to say I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that?" And then I think that's almost word for word what he says when he comes out of the Phantom Zone. It might be that Ruthie is remembering that Krem, was willing to, not willing to, but do you expect me to beg for forgiveness? And then he comes out and begs for forgiveness. And Ruthie's like, oh, he didn't really learn his lesson. He's just BSing us at this point so that he can be free of the Phantom Zone. And that's why if she killed him, that's why she did it.
That's a great callback and a great connection point. Yeah, again, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, another possible interpretation. She doesn't buy
Yeah.
his his rehabilitation. I mean, that is another possible interpretation. It's interesting, and again, I enjoy this aspect of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Even if, like I said, when I first got there, I was a little bit like, oh, okay, like the ending did rub me the wrong way a little bit, but as we talk about it more and we talk about the different ways that maybe you could read it, I'm warming up to it a little bit.
Right. It also begs the question, given that Ruthie is like 13 when this starts out, and at the end of the issue, at the end of the story, she's like 80, and Supergirl's the same age. So either the beginning of the story happened 70 years in the past, or the end of the story is 70 years in the future. Supergirl is wearing that Woman of Tomorrow costume in modern day continuity. She wears it in Dark Crisis. So it just begs the question of, where does this take place in the timeline, which is the nerdiest thing to say when talking about comics. But it's just one of those things that gets in my brain, and I want a resolution, even though I'll never get one.
No, I hear you. I hear you. But I think one of the cool things about this story is, kind of like we were talking about with Up in the Sky. This can really stand on its own, as much as we might want to know where it fits in. So I can appreciate that. So listen, we have been going for just under 2 hours here. Is there anything about either of these two stories that we didn't get to that you really wanted to talk about, or anything else that you wanted to say about them, generally or specifically?
There's a story in Woman of Tomorrow I want to talk about. It's where they go to the planet of the blues and the purples, and everybody on the, it's like they check into this hotel, and there's a column for blue and a column for purple, and the lady's like, well, just sign your name in blue, we're all blue here. And we hear all this stuff about the purples, and we eventually get that Krem had been captured by the people on this planet, and the brigands had come, and the blue people had been subjugating the purple people. They had relegated them to slums, and Krem had talked the brigands into sparing his life in exchange for him suggesting they go wipe out the purple people. And I enjoyed that story because that's the kind of story that gets to me. I like, it's almost a pulp story of this, a whole small town that has this one big dark conspiracy. It's almost Lovecraftian, and that really, just on a literary standpoint, really resonated with me. And it's one of the darkest stories in the trade, but it's the one I enjoyed the most.
No, I hear you. That was definitely a standout. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
No, that's it.
Right on. So, listen, I thank you so much for, rereading these stories and coming on and
Sure.
talking about them with me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I really enjoyed these stories. Up in the Sky especially. And again, I know I'm late. I know I'm joining the chorus here, but I was really surprised, like very pleasantly surprised for all the reasons that we talked about. And that's one that really did earn its spot on the shelf among some of those other kind of evergreen Superman stories we talk about, and especially one that you can really hand to someone. So
Oh,
that
there
was
was
really
one more.
tremendous.
I'm sorry. There was one more element of Up in the Sky I wanted to talk about now that you mention it. Right at the very end, where Superman's fighting all these robots that have been created by the unknowable bad guy, and he's talking about, you know, you know, these are, this is something you can't do. I will defeat you. And instead of Superman giving like this glorious speech about, your villainy will never overcome, Superman's just response every time is, no sir, you will not. And just the understatedness of it, and almost the politeness of it, the forceful politeness of it, is the most Superman thing ever.
That's Pa Kent, man. I feel like that's
Yeah.
just Pa Kent coming out. Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that too. I love that too. Yeah, that was I like that take as well, and that's all he says throughout
Yes.
that chapter until he finally reaches Alice at the very end, and then
Mm-hmm.
I think it becomes a yes, ma'am. So yeah, it's
Yes.
really played beautifully. Now it's the story's tremendous, and Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, didn't shoot to the top of my all time greats list, but I did enjoy it. I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought. I think it's an interesting choice for the movie. I think there are a lot of ways that they can go. I'm curious to see. I'm glad that I read it. It is one I'll read again, and I'd be curious, if I glean something different. But this was a fun reading project, I have to say. So again, thank you, audience. And Grant, where can people go to check out your podcast?
They can find me on Truth, Justice, and Hope, a Superman podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. I talk about relatively modern Superman stories in chronological order, beginning with 2015's Convergence. I am currently about halfway through 2017, and I've just started Dark Knight's Metal. So if you are interested in the rebirth era of DC Comics, of Superman, and the stuff that comes shortly after, be sure to check that out. I think it's a lot of fun, but your mileage may vary.
Now, I encourage everyone to check out Truth, Justice, and Hope. So I hope everyone will do that. So once again, thank you, Grant. Thank you, audience. Make sure you come back in 1 week for our next all new episode. And as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.